Are you all bringing your stuff? Okay.
Well, I am. Just
Yeah.
in case.
Because the
Do you have a particular order?
Do you have a? You don't have a batting order.
Do you want us in any order?
Good morning. How many of you are in the Brafani with no hot water? No, okay, so some of us are braced this morning, or filthy, one or the other. So we're going to talk about moral panic today. Let me first start with a definition of moral panic from, hold on here. Panic, not finding it. Ashley Crossman. So she defines moral panic as a widespread fear, most often an irrational one, that someone or something is a threat to the values, safety, and interests of a community or society at large. Typically, a moral panic is perpetuated by news media, fueled by politicians, and often results in the passage of new laws or policies that target the source of panic. In this way, moral panic can foster increased social control. So the reason I wanted to have this session is that I think we are living somewhere between the optimism we heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about the last few days and the dystopian view of the world that I think we're seeing from other quarters, especially in media and in politics. And the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Whether or not we have a moral panic underway or whether we're heading to that, we'll find out from our discussion here. But I think that the risks of this are still evident. The risk of doing nothing in the face of a problem is evident, but the risk of doing too much in the face of a problem is another matter. I think we want to look at how bad the problem is, or actually first, what are the problems? Defining what the problems we think are, how bad are they? What are the unintended consequences of taking action? What are the unintended consequences of not taking action? And when we worry about the uptake of technology in society, what are we saying about society? So that's what the topic is today. I will come out running into the room after we begin discussing and talking with all of you in the discussion and seeing how panicked you are or how panicked we can get you or how much we can calm you down. I should note that after this at noon, Jay Rosen is in here, but there's also another session right up there about anxiety. So if it gets too bad here, you can go to that session at noon. Jillian, do we have a problem? What is the problem? How bad is it or not?
Yes, I would say that we do.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We should introduce ourselves.
Yes.
And I'll screw that up too, so why don't we each introduce yourselves going down? Jillian.
Sure. My name is Jillian York. I'm the Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a writer.
I'm Alan Rusbridger. I used to edit The Guardian. I'm now based in Oxford, and I run a college, and I chair the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism.
Hi, I'm Tanit Koch. I used to run Bild newspaper in Germany as editor-in-chief, recently quit, and now enjoying my newfound liberty.
I'm Madhav, Chinnappa, and I work on news partnerships at Google.
All right. So, Jillian, problem? No problem.
Yes. So, I mean, I think as many of you did, I watched the Facebook hearings, or at least the first night of them, with a little bit of schadenfreude. But I think that the problem that we're facing with a lot of these conversations is similar to the one that we're facing politically, which to me is sort of we're in an era of binary thinking. Things are good or bad, they're right or left, they're Trump or, well, I won't go there. And so I think that the moral panic is coming out of this idea of we either have to embrace these technologies and these platforms, or we have to reject them entirely. And so when a few weeks ago the delete Facebook movement arose, my reaction was sort of this, really? This is how we want to treat this? I think that we need to be looking at the middle ground, the third way.
And indeed, Jillian, you at the EFF are a protector of the net's potential, of the net's possibilities. So what are you protecting it from?
Yeah, well, I think that what are we protecting it from? Overreach on the part of governments, on the part of platforms. I think that there are real concerns here. I mean, I've been pointing them out for a long time around privacy, around free speech, free expression. But ultimately, I think that we have to look at what people want, what people are doing, what they're using, and approach these problems from the point of view of harm reduction. And so if you're an individual using Facebook, there are a lot of risks that you face doing that, from censorship to having your data snatched up and sold. But I don't think that, telling people to walk away is a very viable solution.
Alan, you and I bonded, I think, originally because I respect you as an editor, but we also saw the possibility for the internet for journalism, and I would probably classify us both as optimists. Are you still?
I think so, yes. I mean, the striking thing about the Facebook hearings last week was the sense that the senators asking the questions really didn't understand the subject. So they all asked a very good first question, and Zuckerberg was rather clever in putting the question back and saying, well, I don't fully understand. Can you explain the question? And none of the senators could. And they moved on to the next question. And I think the danger here is that we rush to some kind of solution based on zero evidence and based on a situation that we're all fumbling to understand in some way, including the people who are building this stuff. The most recent example of moral panic in the UK, there's been a spate of knifings. I mean, it's a serious spate of knifings. And the newspapers and the police and the Prime Minister all got it into their head to say that this was all the fault of social media, in the way that in the past they would have said it was the fault of gangster rap or video games or Marilyn Manson. And I mean, social media may play a part, but we don't know, that there is no evidence. And so the danger in what I think is a moral panic is that you rush to regulatory answers that in 10 years, 20 years' time, you're going to regret. So I think we have to give the whole process time.
Tanit, I don't mean to make you speak for your entire homeland, but I might argue that a lot of this started in Germany in the battle against the platforms and in legislation that was passed, most recently the NetzDG law about hate speech. How do you sense, from your perspective in both media and technology, do we have a problem? Was it overblown? Is it underestimated?
I'm not going to do you the favor to talk about the phenomenon of German angst, because I think that's, we got rid of that a couple of decades ago. But yes, I do think there's a problem. We have a multi-billion industry which is hardly regulated at all. And you know me, I'm actually not in favor of regulation. The German approach to all this started much earlier than the NetzDG, the latest law which concerns social media. It actually started in the 80s when basically German legislature, the Constitutional Court, invented data protection. And it was interesting to listen to the Zuckerberg hearing, that all of a sudden, even in the US, which sort of looked down upon Europe and Germany for that meddling, and God, what are they so worried about, and are now constantly talking about privacy issues. I think that what's worrying me is that if US senators and congressmen do not get the gist of things, how should the general public? I mean, you have the elite there trying to question, and they didn't really grill him, as it sometimes was stated, question Mark Zuckerberg, and they haven't really grasped the matter. So how should society as a whole understand what is happening? I think the problem is that we're faced. Maybe we're not panicking enough, actually, because we're faced with a huge challenge, and it hasn't really entered the general discussion. I'm seriously concerned about the labor market, and the German car industry is really important. There are hundreds of thousands of people working there. So if you take an 8-cylinder engine, as we know it now, it's, I think, comprised of 1,200 parts which have to be put together by humans. If you take an electric car engine, 17 parts, and you don't really need many humans to put that together. So these are middle-class jobs, and AI will not just threaten minimum wage jobs, but will threaten lawyers, accountants, radiologists, etc. And I don't see that this challenge is actually on people's minds.
Madhav, you work at a technology company. I often find myself in the position of defending technology companies or trying to build bridges with media and technology companies. So you get the brunt of this often. But I know you, and I know that you have earnest arguments in favor of the possibilities and opportunities, and you also have thoughtful arguments of concern. What's your perspective on what you see going on kind of in the rest of society about what you're in the midst of?
Well, I'm probably going to be a bit boring and kind of agree with almost everything that's been said so far. And I go back to actually something that you said at the beginning, which is, you know, what are the problems? And if I kind of step back for a second and look at the changes that we're seeing, and these are kind of profound and very, on some levels, very scary changes that are going on through the development of technology. I think that kind of change through technology has always been there through human society. It's actually just accelerating and becoming faster than ever before. So the changes and the questions, and I think we should be asking the right questions. And as you know, as Alan was saying, you know, let's take some evidence-based approach to this, because these do throw up a lot of questions. I mean, from everything from, as you said, you know, as Tanit was saying about jobs and how do we do that, but also I say this as a parent, and I think about screen time for my daughters, right? You know, and these are things that we need to think about that, you know, my parents never had to really think about screen time for us. Well, they did, but it was television, right? And, you know, I'm pretty sure my parents thought I watched too much TV, and I think my daughters are on their phones too much, right? Or phone, to be singular. The 9-year-old's not allowed a phone. But I think we need to ask the right questions, but I would say perhaps not panic, right? And think these through, and to use the T word we were talking about before, think them through thoughtfully, because you don't want to get into the things that were mentioned about unintended consequences and overreaching and binary thinking. I wrote that down. I really like that, because we have an ability, and I think, you know, I'm a news person. I worked at the BBC, and before that at AP. Sometimes we can oversimplify things to get messages across, and that kind of binary thinking can lead you down to some places you probably don't want to go to.
So let's try to catalog the problems, separating out the severity, right? So one is technology and jobs, except for the lawyers. If it eliminates some lawyers, we're all fine with that. But certainly the jobs issue is going to see itself not in the reaction alone to technology, but also in the reaction to immigrants and to trade and globalism. And we see this fear about the future of technology and jobs coming out in all kinds of ways. So this is just one way where technology has an impact. You made reference to your children. We hear an argument that technology is being made to be addictive. I don't buy that, but I am nervous right now that I'm away from my phone, but we'll put that aside. Michael Godwin, he of Godwin's Law, said in a discussion on Facebook about a week ago that he asked people who say that this technology is going to completely change your life. He said, how come it affected 2 billion people but not you? You know, we tend to separate ourselves, but I think there's this issue of our relationship with the technology. What are some of the other issues to catalog that we should be looking at regardless of severity?
I would say the sort of corporate centralization of the ownership of these technologies, the control that companies like Facebook, Twitter, even Google have over our speech, over our data, all of that.
You see, I really like Google. It helps me a lot in my daily life. But I also know that in Germany, Google has, I think, 95% market share. If something isn't on Google, if I don't find it in search, it virtually doesn't exist. So the power, data themselves aren't good or bad, but the question is who controls them and what do you do with them? And if the 5 of us we're sitting in the same plane, there's on the same row, there's a very, very high likelihood that we didn't pay the same price. And not just depending on when did we book, but how did we book and how big is the dossier. My iPhone, my iPad, my laptop has about me stored somewhere where I can't really see it.
Alan?
Well, I think there are so many things bad about the way these companies behave. I'd love to see them pay more tax. I'd love them to take their responsibilities more seriously. I'd love them to be more open and transparent. I'm doing what Madhav hates, using the word them to describe them all. I suppose I mean Facebook especially. But it is terribly early. So I don't know what period of time we want to give them. I mean, if they prove incapable of seeing what's happened in the last few months as a wake-up call, then we know, I think, that then the time's come to reach for regulation or more serious measures. But I would be astonished. It would be suicidal of a company now not to be more open, not to be more transparent, not to find a better way of talking to civic society and to journalists. So let's give them a bit of time. Just
one question there, because we're I think, focusing very much on Europe and the US, but what about China? What about Russia? You could always abuse intelligence. You didn't need artificial in front of that. And I was surprised to hear Elon Musk say in a documentary, I think a couple of days ago, that he warns about an immortal dictator, so people like Stalin or Hitler, at least they died at some point. But if you create the monster, the artificial intelligent monster, it may not die. So are we actually preparing for what could happen if sort of the not so very good guys, who we I think share the same ethics with in Western Europe or in Europe as a whole and the US, but somewhere across the world or even somewhere in our countries, do intend to do a lot of bad with what they can do.
So this notion of AI is a proxy for a lot of this fear, because it is the ultimate black box. But it also presents the opportunity to be a solution to so many problems. And we heard Zuckerberg say again and again and again, we're trying to train our AI to be able to recognize this stuff. I think there's two parts of that. One is the black box nature. It's a mystery. We don't know how it operates because we all feel stupid next to it. But the other one is the question of scale. I think a lot of what's happening now is that scale is scaring us. And I've said earlier here in Perugia that scale is what provides the opportunity. The scale of the internet provides the opportunity for anyone to speak to anyone the world around. Never possible before. But scale also makes it impossible to monitor that in a way that we're used to in media. So this notion of AI has this future, oh my God, we're creating a new dictator. I'd call that heading toward moral panic.
When it comes from Elon Musk, that's if some, I don't know, what's the word for some apocalyptic thinker would say that, I probably wouldn't even have remembered it. If it comes from Elon Musk, who is in this business, I think we should at least discuss it.
Well, I think that's the point about trying to be thoughtful about these issues, right? I think that, and again, going back to this, I really like the binary thinking thing. I'm going to keep that one. Right? We do seem to slip into these binary thinkings of, what AI is going to destroy all jobs, or, it's going to solve all known problems, and those are the two options you got, right? And the reality is, in the beginning, it's going to be something in between. And I think, I always say I'm kind of like I'm the technically dumbest person at Google, right? I'm a news person. But what I see in terms of AI is that the approach, at least that we're taking, is that it's around assistance, right? And it's trying to help you with something. So it's not going to be an end in and of itself. It's going to be something, and that's what technology is. Technology is a way of doing something, right? It's not a be-all and end-all of it. And it throws up all these issues. And jobs is rightly one to consider. There is also, efficiency and automation. And again, going back to the history, if you look at this, you know, that's why the Luddites didn't like machines, right? Because they were worried about how that happens. And societies develop and progress and go into different areas, and jobs are going to move into different areas that they may not have been before. And that's how, I mean, the beauty of that, at least in my optimistic view, is that's how human society evolves. And we're in a stage where we're dealing with these issues, which are profound, and we need to be thoughtful about them to be able to get as much of the right and as much of the harm reduction as we can, because everything is going to be a double-sided sword, right? It's going to be good and there's going to be bad, and we have to, you know, try and maximize the good and minimize the bad. But you're never going to eliminate one of those, right? I think that's how we develop.
Jillian, you work among all the technologists. On the one hand, you defend the opportunities they present. On the other hand, you push them to behave better. How do you see the discussion around advanced technologies?
Sure. I mean, most of my experience with it is around what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about the other night during the hearings, the use of algorithms, the use of machine learning and AI for content moderation. So a really specific, narrow issue, but I think it's an interesting one in that when we talk about it, we're talking about jobs, and that's certainly an issue, but you know, Zuckerberg was saying that they're hiring, what, 20,000, I think, was it? 20,000 more people to deal with the issue of speech, of hateful speech, of other kinds of speech. And at the same time, they're implementing the use of AI for that same purpose. And so on the one hand, you have more people, on the other hand, you have more technology. But my concern there is actually where those two things overlap. Who's training the machines? What are they being taught? And what sort of human bias is being put into it in the first place? And so when you look right now, or historically, at how content moderation has been done, a lot of it comes out of the Philippines. A lot of it is being done by low-wage workers who, and this is, you know, speaking of Facebook, I can't speak to every company, but a lot of it's being done in these places where people are not getting solid training. They don't have the fancy lunches and the dry cleaning and all of the things that their peers in California have. And then who, you know, there's a bias there, and then who's going to actually train the technology to do the same job? And will that same bias come in? Will it be a different bias, et cetera?
What kind of transparency? Because the question that I hear that I hate is, show us your algorithm. You wouldn't know what the fuck to do with it if you got it, right? It's ridiculous. But some measure of transparency behind the principles or the goals, or what are the models of transparency behind machine learning that would be informative and would be helpful to know?
Well, I think instead of being at war with journalism, maybe this is particularly true of the UK, but journalists have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues for centuries. And I think a proper dialogue between journalists who have been used to dealing with these issues of how you tell whether stuff is true or not, you know, so the really basic stuff, and issues around the ethical considerations of journalism, of sources, how you moderate stuff, how you deal with hate speech. I mean, some of these are very new issues, some of these are not new issues. And I mean, I feel sort of slightly sorry in a way for these companies. I mean, there was a sort of look of, not quite terror on Zuckerberg's face, but I think it's been a very sobering year for him to move to the kind of scale at which he now operates. It's not an excuse for everything, but it's an excuse for some of it. And I think these people need some help. They need moral philosophers in there. They need journalists and everything in between.
Yeah, I agree. I think. Well, let me ask the question. If tomorrow Facebook came to you, Alan Rusbridger, and said, okay, we take this argument of hiring a high-level editor into our culture to bring to it the sense of public responsibility. What role could you imagine for yourself that would be productive and helpful to both sides inside Facebook? Well,
I mean, they keep saying that they're going to do that, don't they? And then they somehow it never works. So I don't know why that is. Is it?
Well, invent the job description that they should do.
Yeah. Well, I think. I mean, it would be a lovely job. Yes, please. Can
I just say that at Tanit, you're looking for a job, right? So Facebook, if there's anybody from Facebook in the room.
Or Google can always hire Tanit too. Yeah. So we'll get to that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you would stage those conversations, and maybe they're happening within Facebook or not. It's difficult to tell. I've found them a rather opaque and difficult company to have a conversation with, because they tend to feel shiny people who smile a lot, rather than have a proper conversation. But they've got to learn to have those conversations, and actually journalists are quite good at hosting those conversations.
Can I make a comment? I think being a news person who's been at a technology company, and you and I have talked about this, is that my feeling is that technology companies have very different cultures, and particularly Silicon Valley culture is very different, I think, and sometimes quite in a bubble. I think one of the things that Google has learned over the years is that actually we need to open up more, we need to have more of a dialogue and do that, and we've been trying to do that for a number of years now. I can't comment on Facebook, but I think that they're earlier into that process, right? And that's why we created things like the Digital News Initiative and now the Google News Initiative, and the other things that we try to do to be more, to do sort of exactly what Alan says there, which is to have that dialogue and collaborate more. I've said to Facebook myself, I think that they should be doing more of that, because I think overall when we look at these big issues, to be thoughtful about this, you need different sets of voices, different opinions, different things that people won't all agree on, but you need to have that diversity of voices, because it will then get, I think, more educated results from that, rather than kind of very siloed thinking or very, reactive thinking. I think that's the other thing that I worry about in a moral panic, is that people just say, oh, we need to do X, and that's it, and they shut everything down, right? Which, you've seen.
But who would actually say that? We've had a discussion, for instance, about genetics, which I think is overregulated, or genetic research is overregulated in Germany, is less regulated in Israel, and they get better results as we do. But I don't see this sort of running completely out of hand. The trouble I see is that it's actually not discussed enough at all. And the discussion we're having here in Perugia, or having on Capitol Hill, is largely an elite discussion, and we've seen in the last couple of years what lack of trust in the establishment, in journalism and politics, etc., can do to society, how it feeds into populists, how it helps hyper-partisan movements and parties. And here we have probably the biggest revolution of our lifetime coming up, or we're right in the middle of it, and there is no general discussion about it. So you don't get me wrong, I do see the good, of course, in artificial intelligence. A former colleague lost his wife to cancer because a lab overlooked a tumor marker. Would this happen to a robot? Probably not. Would I like a robot to take over that job? Yes, of course. Does a robot have a more stable hand in surgery than any surgeon? Yes. But would I still love a surgeon to overlook the whole operation? Of course I do. So what you said about who's teaching the machines, I think we all remember the Microsoft chatbot, which learned to be a sexist and racist pig within less than 24 hours by Twitter. So there are, of course, issues for concern. But in Germany, there still is, and I think in the US or Britain, it's a better situation. In Germany, kids still don't have coding classes in school on the level that they have maths classes or chemistry classes. So why is that? Why are we sitting here and discussing this? Why isn't it a general discussion in public?
Alan. Well, Madhav's right that I think it's easier to have this conversation with Google than with Facebook. But I also, I suppose it's important to say at some point in this discussion, because there's a danger of journalism sounding terribly smug, we can teach them a lot. I think we have to be a bit humble and say they can teach us a lot. I mean, in one conversation I did have with a smiley Facebook person recently, and there was all the usual thing about, you're leeching off journalists and you're taking all our revenues and you ought to, and he just said, well, the thing we're struggling to understand is this journalism that you want us to support, what is it? I mean, and in the context of British journalism, that's quite a searching question, because there's an awful lot of, well, not just British journalism, global journalism, there's an awful lot of really bad journalism as well. And I think sometimes having the mirror put back at us would be something useful that would come out of this dialogue.
Amen. Let's talk about media's role in the current, I'll call it a panic. Ellen, I think you and I were around in the earlier days of the web and journalism, and much, maybe perhaps too much, optimism and hope and wonder at it. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but I see in many parts of media a dystopian view of technology coming across, that the coverage has gone incredibly negative. Am I imagining that?
No, you're entirely right, and some of that's entirely understandable. It was really nice being a journalist in the olden days. We had a kind of superiority in metaphorically and almost literally. We felt ourselves to be above the audience. We had a monopoly of distribution. We had a monopoly of access to news, a near monopoly, and we literally, almost literally handed down, and that placed us in a very desirable and powerful position. And you can see journalists scrabbling, thinking at last, maybe we can get back to that position. And to my mind, that's never going to happen. So I think that in some senses we're seeing the last gasp of a generation of people for whom they still hold out this hope that they can get back up on the platform.
Jillian, what's your view of the coverage that you see
Sure.
of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I slid in kind of at the end of the blogging era into this, and so 2008, 2009 was when I started writing professionally. And I think that there's been a generational shift, honestly. I mean, I think a lot of it is when you look at who are the editors-in-chief, yes, of a lot of the sort of popular technology websites now, Motherboard, et cetera. They're millennials. I'm a millennial, and I think that we kind of grew up in this era where technology companies took over from the more distributed platforms. You know, when I first started writing, it was LiveJournal and then WordPress, and so there was a lot more diversity going on, and now everything is centralized and located within these platforms, and I think that we're seeing a backlash toward that, possibly rightfully. Again, not the moral panic, but I think that a lot of the anger is justified.
Madhav, what do you see that frustrates you in coverage?
In terms of the coverage, it doesn't surprise me at all, and it reminds me of, I don't know if it was when I was at the BBC or the AP, I had a senior editor to me said, oh, there's a really simple arc for ongoing stories about things. In the beginning, something is unusual, and either it's kind of cool, or it's cute, or it's weird, and that's how it starts. And then it goes in one of two directions. Either it becomes the best thing ever, or it's the worst thing ever, right? And then no matter what, it has to flip, right? And you see that with you know, and the common thing in the UK was often celebrities. Oh, this person's interesting, then they become, oh, aren't they wonderful? And then you got to knock them down, right? And that's the arc. And it's not, and technology, I think, has gone through that arc in different ways, as has celebrity X or, you know, other issue Y, and it goes through that. So I think we're just doing that, and that kind of saddens me, because again, I think it's actually, it's a bit superficial, and that's what it worries me, if it leads to consequences or actions that are superficial.
What's the media presumption that frustrates you most from your perspective?
It's the one that Alan said, which is that all technology companies are the same, right? And there's a serious point behind that, which is that, you know, they are, you know, if you look at not just Google and Facebook, but Amazon and Apple, and if you add them in there, they are four fundamentally different companies that do four very different things, have four different business models, and I would also say probably have four different philosophies, right? So lumping them all together, and this is the point that I make, which is that if you lump them all together, you actually let them off the hook, right? What you should be doing is being much more nuanced about this and saying, you know, here are the issues that are particular to and you can go beyond the company and say that, yeah, okay, these are for search engines, and these are for social networks, and, you know, these are for, you know, closed operating systems, and these are for, you know, shopping platforms, right? But you need to look at them that way, because mixing them all together, I think, is where I get worried about.
But what they do have in common is that they're largely comprised of engineers. And if you take a bunch of lawyers, that's a more similar mindset than mixed lawyers with sociologists and journalists. And if you have that huge number of engineers, you're totally right, very, very different companies, but still with a mindset of an engineer, which is sometimes extremely helpful and important, but sometimes not well, helpful enough on its own. I think you do need some outside input. Let me just add one thing to the media coverage. I think this year is the 50th birthday of Space Odyssey, and I can hardly think of any Hollywood movie that has a positive approach to technology. And of course, you want Arnold Schwarzenegger to win, and not that other guy in Terminator. But it is basically apocalyptic thinking, and generations of movie watchers have been trained to be worried about what technology brings to their life, and not been trained to see the good it can also bring.
So let's talk about the presumptions that we make about the public and society in this discussion. Because my fear is, I think that in this Perugia, I'm hearing a desire to return to elitism, right? Oh, good, we're gatekeepers again, because they need us, because they're screwing it up. And my contention of late has been that what the internet really killed is the mass media business model, and with it mass media, and with it the idea of the mass. And that people can now speak and be heard as individuals and members of communities in ways never possible before. But I think that when we say, oh, they're all stupid out there, they don't understand what Facebook is, they don't understand what technology is, they're ruining their lives, they're addicted to it, they elected Trump, we're risking an elitism returning here in this discussion of technology that we think we're smarter than all of them.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it is a bad thing. A lot of the work that I've done over the years has been advocating for the user, and we risk doing that too in my line of work. We absolutely risk the same elitism, don't get me wrong. But in talking with people all over the world, not just in the US, but in all different places, people who've experienced censorship on platforms, people who've experienced censorship by governments, they know more than the journalists a lot of the time, honestly. They've experienced it. They have, this, and watching the hearings the other night really, kind of hit home for me, because I was thinking, wow, like, I'm not sure that Mark Zuckerberg or these senators know what they're talking about. I was thinking, wow, I could explain content moderation better than the CEO of that company. Like, that's terrifying to me. So I think we need to move away from elitism, and I think we need to recognize that the users of these platforms, or internet users, or whatever you want to, people, know what they're doing, and we don't need to save them from themselves. We don't need to save them from these companies, but what we do need to do is build those bridges, connect people to the companies, and everyone needs to be listening a little bit better on every side.
Anyone else on the view of the public?
Well, I think it's quite interesting, in the context of Trump and Brexit, and other populist movements that the so-called liberal elite, that's me and you, are chastised for not listening to these people. Yet often the newspapers who say that are the ones who have started to turn off comments underneath the articles and say, well, that was an experiment we tried, but actually they're horrible. Our readers are morons, it turns out, and we don't want to hear from them, and we certainly don't want to engage with them. And I think this is why journalism is getting quite a lot wrong at the moment. It's still operating in this vertical world, and it can't get a hold of this horizontal world, and it doesn't really want to engage with it, certainly on their own platforms. Journalists keep getting the prediction business hideously wrong, which is not a good look for journalists, to be wandering around saying, sorry, I got that election wrong, sorry, I got that referendum wrong, sorry, we'll try harder next time. But there's now a disconnect between what journalism is trying to do and this business of not really wanting to hear from readers is a small symptom of that.
Tanit, at Bild, you spoke for and to and served the common man and woman, right? And as a boulevard paper, that's the culture and worldview of that. And we should note, in Germany, there have been very interesting experiments at Die Zeit. They did Deutschland spricht, where they had people who disagreed with each other, 14,000 of them, meet one day in June and talk to each other. And then you, at Bild, were going back to your hometown and going back to try to meet the people in a way. What's your perspective of the common person in all of this?
Well, there isn't the common person, but I think there is a lot of bigotry around in journalism. Just to add to what Alan said, yes, a lot of media companies turned off the comment section because we didn't want to afford, or some couldn't afford, the amount of monitoring going on. Where do we send the people to? We send them to Facebook. And now we're all complaining about all that amount of hate speech going on in the Facebook comment section. Because what is happening there on a much, much larger scale is what we've seen happening on our comment platforms. Only that Facebook can't turn that off, or can't say, okay, from 11 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning it's just trolls and idiots around, and we'll turn off Facebook. With Bild, we did a 7-week tour through the country before the German general election, and it was fascinating because, you see, we love talking about filter bubbles and, again, blaming Mark Zuckerberg for the filter bubble, whereas Berlin Mitte, the central part of Berlin, where the parliamentary quarter is in itself a huge filter bubble without the help of Mark Zuckerberg. So I think Tom Wolfe said that the failure of American journalists to predict Trump's victory is one of the biggest failures after the financial crisis, which we also didn't predict in the history of journalism, whereas the colleagues from New York and Washington would have only had to go out and travel the country for a couple of weeks to see what was actually going on. And what we realized was going on was that, for instance, the refugee topic was still on sort of top of the agenda, whereas it wasn't discussed in politics. So as I said, I fear that the discussion we're having about sort of technological challenges is largely one led by the tech companies, some journalists, not enough politicians actually, because they don't seem to really grasp it, and they too often think in their electoral term, and you don't win elections on topics like that. But apart from all the good technology is bringing and the challenges for bad it could also bring, I think we shouldn't forget that actually talking to each other, as simple as it sounds, on an eye-to-eye level, is essential for our job in journalism, and I think has been neglected too much during the last decades.
Can I just make a small comment on comments, right? Which is, talking about moral panic and unintended consequences, but in different countries they have different laws about liability of news organizations about comments in their comment section. And I would say that's probably been, and the kind of cost of moderation has been probably the majority, it's been that's been the majority reason that people have shut down comments, right, in a number of places. Because you had a law that made them liable, you had to bring in moderation, that was quite expensive to do at scale, and so therefore the simpler option was to just shut it down. And again, I think that's not good for public civic discourse, and that's kind of an unintended consequence of a law.
But I would also say, to Jillian's point, we are in very early days, we're still reinventing this. When Facebook said recently that they wanted to shift to meaningful interactions between people, I responded and said, okay, good, but A, I'd say meaningful interactions among people, it's not one-on-one, and number two, I fear that we're going to switch from clickbait to comment bait. That engagement, attention, those are the metrics we use now, and that's still media-centric and it's still limited in its definition of community. I think there's a lot of invention yet to be done in how the internet enables people to gather as communities and then to build bridges among them. And I think we have to give time for that to happen. And speaking of building bridges, I'm now going to come out in the room. Questions, arguments, fears, anything at all. I'll run the mic. I'll run the mic. I like doing this. I like to be Oprah Winfrey, an American reference. Please identify yourselves when you talk.
Tomasz Kellner, I'm here from GE Reports. I had a question for Alan. Alan, you mentioned the demise of the editor-in-chief, but isn't a danger, the reason why we're talking about moral panic, that as editor-in-chief is going to be replaced by an algorithm, something that you just mentioned about the news feed, that it's actually going to be a piece of code that's going to decide what we're going to read?
The Alan algorithm, yes.
The acoustic in this room is so boomy. Oh. I heard something about editor-in-chief, and then I didn't hear anything more.
I think it was. Is the algorithm going to replace the editor? Is that the?
Yeah, basically the demise of the editor-in-chief.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The algorithm to replace it. What does that look like?
Yeah. No, I'm against that. No, but I think the danger is that editors-in-chief and journalists in general are cutting themselves off from the way that a lot of information now moves. We can't see it, but it's happening at a vast scale. And I think the answer to say, well, actually, we're not going to allow that on our platform. We don't want that, and we want to try and return to a position where the editor-in-chief. I mean, if you really want that, you have to think very hard about trust and why anybody would trust me or any other editor-in-chief in future. And that's a very big question that I think journalism hasn't come close to addressing yet.
Bobby.
Thanks, I'm Bobby. We've been talking mostly about fairly open platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google. The one word I've not heard discussed yet is WhatsApp. Coming as I have recently from India, WhatsApp is, if I feel any sense of panic, it's about WhatsApp. It's not really about Google or Facebook. WhatsApp is also where a lot of panic is generated. A lot of moral panic is generated, amplified. WhatsApp also, to some degree, represents what you're talking about, which is this sort of horizontal plane where people are talking to each other, but quite often talking nonsense to each other and sort of cranking up that nonsense, cranking up that panic. Should we be worried about WhatsApp? Is there a way? Is artificial intelligence going to solve that problem? I'd be curious to hear basically anybody in the panel who wants to address this.
So I think it's interesting. I'm curious which cultural context or country-based context you're thinking of, because I know that, I'm sure there are some people in the audience going like, what's that? But that's just the thing that I talk with my friends and family on. And then there are places where you have politicians or other public figures talking in sort of a one-to-many thread. I mean, I think there was, I can't remember exactly where, but there was somewhere recently that the network pretty much almost collapsed on the fact that there was someone sending out such huge threads of messages. And so I find it hard to be concerned about WhatsApp in the sense that it is just a simple platform. Rather, I am concerned about the way that it's being used. And I don't think that, I don't see a technical solution to that. I see a human or a social solution to that, which I understand is a frustrating thing to say, of course, because, but in this case, it's not, I don't see it the same way as I see Facebook or search engine algorithms, in the sense that you have a company that's actually building control and manipulation into the way that we get information. Rather, it's a simple platform that is being used in a certain negative way.
Well, but let's talk about that for a moment,
sure,
because I think what Bobby is talking about, and I want to hear more from you about what you saw when you were at the Hindustan Times in India, but in Colombia, journalists tell me that WhatsApp was the vehicle by which the peace referendum was defeated, and that there was information being passed around. And the problem that I think Bobby raises is we can't see it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying people shouldn't have their private communication. Of course they should. But we can see the manipulation. The argument of Facebook is that they didn't do enough to recognize the manipulation that was apparent. Now, I would argue again that scale made that much more difficult than anyone realizes. But at least you could go in and see it. And Zuckerberg said, well, communication is encrypted. We can't read that. We can't see that. Say a little bit more about what you saw in the kinds of things that were being spread on WhatsApp.
Sure. I think part of the problem, if for a second, the reason why those who are doing a lot of the deep thinking about these things are missing out on what's happening in WhatsApp is that they're in countries where WhatsApp is not a big deal, or primarily in the US. We have a lot of these discussions about social media and its impact in the US, but the US is almost unique in that WhatsApp is not a major feature in public life. But if you go outside America, if you go to countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, WhatsApp is far, far more prevalent and much more insidious. Yes, it may be a simple platform, but it is a platform that allows people anonymously to promote the most retrograde and vicious ideas, to communicate hate speech with complete impunity, to create echo chambers, to create communities of basically fellow travelers in hatred, where I think we who are sitting in the US tend to miss it. I certainly missed it. Well, I used to think when I live in New York, from New York, WhatsApp seemed to me simply a way, a slightly more invasive way in which my weird uncle could invade my privacy in a way that, I could turn him off in Facebook, but I couldn't with WhatsApp. But when I went to India, that was an eye-opener. Political movements, religious movements, flat earthers, the Indian equivalent of birthers, all of these people live and thrive in the dark social like mushrooms going wild, in a way that really ought to be terrifying us. They may not have an influence on the US election, but they're having an influence on, it's having an influence in the way that 80% of the world thinks and behaves.
Yeah, just to make a quick comment, which is, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jillian.
I just had a quick question as well. I mean, so I don't live in the US, and I do use WhatsApp on a daily basis, but my question was, how are people getting the numbers to send those messages? Because I think that's the part that's really unclear to a lot of people.
I don't think we fully understand yet. It's self-selecting in a certain way, but it does sort of move out from a small group to a large group very, very quickly. So to give you an example, it's a very simple example, but I had multiple WhatsApp groups because I had to. If you're a journalist operating in some of these countries, if you don't have WhatsApp, you're blind to what's going on. So I had multiple groups, and I would get one, let's say, flat earth theory from one group about some weird pseudoscience that someone was putting out. And within 15 minutes, there was this Chinese whispers phenomenon where the same thing was coming to me from 50 different WhatsApp groups and people saying, have you seen this? And pretty soon, in the next turn of that cycle, each of those different sources was adding a little more to that original and trying to connect it to something else. And 24 hours later, the thing is now this completely different creature from where it had started, where, initially it was, well, so-and-so God-man has come up with the idea of a flat earth, to a day later, a scientist from Oxford University has proven that the earth is flat, and that is the sort of thing that takes place in light speed, and we have unless we're paying very, very close attention and unless we are part of this part of these 50 different groups, this will go under the radar and yet reach hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, just to make a quick comment on that, I think the Reuters Institute have done some research about the different use of WhatsApp from a news perspective as well. And I think what's really interesting in that is just how the countries are so different. I'm Indian, so I totally get the weird uncle WhatsApp group. Yeah, we have that. But I think it's important for everybody I would commend that research to have a look at it, because it is another channel. It may not be completely relevant in the US or in the UK or in Germany, but it is being used in a different way. And I think that shows the point about the different channels are being used in different ways, and we need to be understanding that this is happening, and then therefore figure out what to do with it.
And Jillian's point is right. It's not the technology that's causing it. It is creating the opportunity for certain agents who are cleverly manipulating. And I think that I was a dogmatic believer in openness in the internet, and the problem with that, I think I saw, and Ed Williams said this recently, we didn't anticipate the bad behavior. So we didn't build in the system sufficiently to anticipate that and then to deal with that, I think. Go ahead.
Just one more quick comment on that. I mean, I think it's also reminiscent of the way that Facebook groups works and the way that it was changed a few years ago, it's very frustrating for me. I end up getting added, because Facebook allowed you to add people to groups without their consent, which is the same thing that WhatsApp does. You can add people without their consent. And so all of a sudden I was being added to racist groups, I was being added to groups that were pretty much just set up to sexually harass people. I mean, this is something that it happens in my Twitter DMs as well. If you have your Twitter DMs open, and a lot of it's spam, and some of it's just pure sexual harassment. And I think that that's part of the problem too, is that a lot of these companies and the people who work at the top of them are not thinking about those unintended consequences. They're not thinking about what it means for people when you add them to a group without their consent.
Right, okay.
Thank you. Dimitri from the BBC. So my question is, or rather comment, is that I'm concerned that us as representatives of Western media largely, we completely disregarding the situation about the second internet, which is prevalent in Asia. So Tanit, you referred to it. So hundreds of millions of people in China are using something which people in the West are not even aware of. They have their own version of Google, their own version of Twitter, stuff like that. So a court in Moscow just blocked Telegram, a messaging app, this morning, again leading to probably the biggest anti-internet action the Russian government has ever taken in the last few years. So I'm just wondering, what can we do to have that discussion going on in a much more, I guess, how can we take that discussion rather than not only concentrating on the Western social media platforms and others, but actually take a wider view of the Earth or population as a whole, rather than just only concentrating on what's relevant to the West?
Well, I think we have to take the discussion from Wired magazine, where you had that amazing article about social credit, which was eye-opening for me in China, to mainstream media, to get the discussion going in a larger Western audience who doesn't speak. I think it's there's a language gap, of course, because English is a world language. Chinese is spoken by many Chinese. But we can't. It's a different political system, social system, and then it's a completely foreign language to us, as is Russian to most of us. So thanks to media like the BBC, which have a world service, and another mass media who should sort of dig into that a lot more than they do now, I guess.
I think it's an incredibly important point, and there was a huge moral panic around the time of Snowden and since, in which there was a moral panic then over encryption, and you saw a lot of Western politicians, every time something nasty happens, standing up and saying encryption was a bad thing and must be ended. You really thought these people need to have lessons in encryption to understand what it is. And when we were doing stories about Tor, the onion router, that story itself exemplified the twin uses of that, a thing built with the aid of the State Department to enable people to speak freely and for whistleblowers to be able to blow their whistles, but loathed by the Pentagon and the intelligence services because other bad things started to happen. But I think you always have to remember the people who value encryption for perfectly good free speech reasons.
I'd also suggest that everybody read the digital news report, which is, covers 36 countries and talks about different uses in different countries, and you can see the differences between countries and how people are using things like WhatsApp or other things like that, to just at least be educated about the differences, which I find really fascinating.
I'm back here now.
Hi, Marina Callan from the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. I want to talk about the echo chambers, because technology allows us obviously to target audiences, and audiences sort of almost self-select which news outlets they read and follow. Is it a good thing? Because everybody's sort of blaming mainstream media. It's sort of mainstream media bashing is sort of favorite pastime. But do we need mainstream media to start to try to build bridges? How do we break from echo chambers? Because that's what technology allowed us to do, even more so than before. But please just don't say we need to. We do know that we do. But how do you do it?
Well, some people, I guess, would suggest that for instance, the readership of the Daily Mail is one big echo chamber. So I think a lot has been going on for much longer than we think now. Same about fake news. I heard an American studies professor from Germany tell a wonderful story about the American election in the 1820s between Adams and Jefferson. And the Adams campaign team was spreading the news that Thomas Jefferson actually wanted to reinstate monarchy in the US and wanted to marry off his children to the British royals. The Jefferson electoral campaign team, however, said that no need to vote for Adams because he's dead. He died. And this at the time was fake news and of course lingered around for days and weeks because there were no mass media, no mainstream media on large scale to counter that those fake news. I do think that a lot of the concerns are there because we now see what is there. I think people have been having those thoughts for much longer than we realized, and I'm quite thankful actually that because of the internet, because of social media, people like us who aren't or who think they aren't in echo chambers, we all may be in the odd filter bubble ourselves, get confronted with yes, the odd Indian uncle and the flat earthers and the chemtrailers, to be actually able, outside of those WhatsApp groups, to inform the general public.
I want to argue, too, for a moment that one solution to this, I think, I'm going to use this as a very slick transition here, is not only the communities themselves, but also a wider array in the ecosystem of media, and to support more players in media for more communities. And I'm using that as a transition to give a momentary plug here. In full disclosure, this involves the News Integrity Initiative. But this morning, the European Journalism Center announced a major plan to support innovation in media, and I think it goes to that question, and some of you here may want to apply, so I want to give just a moment to Adam Thomas to talk about that.
Jeff, you're a slick operator, thank you. Yeah, so I'm the director of the European Journalism Center, and I've spent the last 2 years touring Europe, and I think one of the solutions to this type of work is to empower newsrooms that are putting communities and their conversations really at the heart of fixing this problem. It's something we're super passionate about, and Jeff is as well. So we've launched this morning an Engaged Journalism Accelerator. It's a 1.7 million euro fund, extensive coaching, grants and events that are going to spread across 47 countries in Europe. The News Integrity Initiative are a super generous partner of this, and what we hope to do is really empower newsrooms that are putting communities, conversations at the heart of not just their editorial, but also their revenue strategies as well. We're also excited to announce that Civil are going to come on board as a partner for this. Civil are, I think, providing a really interesting opportunity for technology to play a role here, but they also share the same type of vision as well. So Daniel, maybe you want to say something.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. Hey, Madhav.
Hey, Daniel.
I'm Daniel Seberg. I'm a co-founder at Civil and lead our business development. I want to thank Adam and the EJC and the News Integrity Initiative for being such thoughtful partners in this. We are a scrappy startup. We are trying to build a decentralized platform for sustainable journalism through blockchain technology. I haven't heard blockchain mentioned here yet today, but we think that there's an opportunity through blockchain to help allow this kind of openness and transparency. I think it plays a lot into, or we think it plays a lot into this idea of the sort of morality panic that's been talked about here today. And we're excited to see what's going to be fostering here in Europe as a result of this fund. So thanks, Adam. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you for your indulgence with that plug for NII, but I think it's good work that some of you may want to talk to them, and they're right over there. So, I appreciate the thoughtful, nuanced, calm discussion we in fact have had. I think there are earnest issues to deal with, but I still worry, I'm still panicking about the panic. I still worry that we could go overboard and we could end up with legislation and regulation that limits the opportunities that we have. Any closing thoughts from any and all of you?
Well, I think I would say, again, forgive me, I'm kind of agreeing with everybody here. I think we need to be absolutely cognizant of both ends of these spectrums, right? So that we can actually get to something in the middle. And I think we need to be talking much more. We need to be, and I say this from a Google perspective, Google needs to be listening much more. So I'll shut up very soon. But I think that also we need to be having that dialogue with the legislators as well, right? You know, if as Tanit was saying, and I think Jillian was saying as well, if you learned one thing from at least definitely day one of Mark Zuckerberg's testimony, it was that sometimes the legislators may not know enough, if I'm being polite. And we need to be very, you know, that's the thing we should be worried about. And to combat that, I think we need to have a better dialogue, right? And we need to help and discuss and talk this all through rather than take that kind of binary thinking that people are getting into.
I think I've always had difficulty with the term morals himself, not because I was a tabloid editor, but because if you think back about the morals of the 1950s, is that something relevant to us now? What about in 50 years' time when we look at the morals of today's society? I think the questions we should ask are fundamentally ethical, and they're still not answered, and it's even unclear who's answering them. So I'd hope for a democratic process of answering those fundamentally ethical questions we've raised here today.
I'm not going to put Madhav on the spot to answer his own question, but I'll ask you, are legislators educable?
Yes, I think they are. And I think we should give them credit. The problem with legislators at the moment is that, again, talking for Germany, we still have legislation going back to the times of the German Empire with copper wires into the country. If you look at telecommunications industry, they're begging for a modernization of legal system to adapt to not even AI, the AI age, but to the digital age. So there's just, and I think we're not fast enough in keeping up with the technological changes.
Just to sort of answer the question, I think they definitely are, but it's not a one-way thing. And actually, I think it's about creating a process where you have a discussion over this. Because I think, and like I said, I totally love the binary thinking, but I think sometimes the dialogue happens in a very binary way, right? And so actually, and I don't know what the solution is, but I hope that there is a process that you can have the discussion in a non-binary fashion, not kind of, argue this outcome versus this outcome, but but discuss the issue.
Which should be convened by the likes of journalism and academic institutions. Alan.
Three things. One is this point. I don't think legislators are ready to legislate yet. They don't understand it. And that goes for a lot of the rest of us as well. So we all have to raise our game and try to understand it, but particularly if you're going to legislate, you have to understand this stuff much better than they do at the moment. Second is we have to have evidence. This discussion about echo chambers, there's lots of evidence that says there's no such thing as echo chambers, that actually people are much more exposed to proliferation of sources than before. So we don't actually have the evidence on which to base the discussion that might lead to legislation. And the third thing is it's evidently some of these companies have got to change, and they have to convince us that they're changing. And they have to realize that they have moved from being tech companies to being intrinsic parts of society and how society now operates. And that's a profound shift. And I guess they need to convince us that they realize that. That was it. Yeah.
All right, recommendations for 3 different groups. I think that as a society, we need to start asking different questions from the root. What kind of internet do we want? Who do we want to have control over these things? What sort of spaces do we want to engage in? I think companies need to shake things up a little bit. Mark Zuckerberg's been in his position for too long. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me on that one, but it's time to step aside, let some new blood in. But I mean, more than that, I think, open up their ears, listen, and that. And then lastly, I think that when it comes to journalism, I think, again, with asking these questions, I think journalism got on some of these questions that we're talking about now a little bit too late. I think that civil society was talking about some of these issues of control 10 years ago. I couldn't get a piece placed, and now they're demanding them. And so 10 years ago, it was really difficult, and it wasn't just me, it was other people too, of course. But it was really difficult to ask some of these questions. It was difficult to put in these pieces that say, okay, do we want companies to have this much centralized control? Now we're asking them, it's a bit too late. And so I think there's really change for everyone to make.
Yesterday, at the end of this session, I pointed out, when was this building built? Does anyone know? 1273. Now you know. Matthew pointed this out, right? So Gutenberg's printing was invented in approximately 1450. And it sobers us, I think, about where we are in this progression. My argument at the end is, it is too early to panic. We are still making this thing of the internet. We don't know what it is yet. We still see the future in the analog of the past. And when printing was popularized by Gutenberg and company, Erasmus feared what books would do to the human mind and called them paper bullets that would destroy our thinking. I think we see similar talk today. We see similar talk through the days of the telegraph. I just found out that the reason Madhav is ruined is because he has 4,000 comic books, and we know what comic books do to young people. We've gone through many kinds of panics that in the end are fundamentally insulting to the public. In the end, the question is, do we have faith in our fellow men and women that we will figure this out? I still do. Thank you very, very much for coming out.
Buongiorno. Good morning or afternoon. There's lots of seats up front. Nobody ever likes to sit up front. Anyway, good morning, good afternoon. My name's Matthew Ingram. I'm not going to talk a lot about myself. I'm going to talk about the person that I'm introducing. It gives me great pleasure to be here to introduce someone who I consider to be both a mentor and a friend. Some of you may know that Jay Rosen is a journalism professor at New York University, and that he's runs an experimental program there called Studio 20. And some of you may know that he's been one of the leading journalism academics in the US for, I think, a couple of decades anyway. But more than that, I think Jay's been the standard bearer, if you will, for a bunch of journalistic concepts or new media concepts that are effectively shaping the world that we see around us. Jay was among the first people to champion the idea of what we now call crowdsourcing for journalistic purposes, something I feel very strongly about. In 2006, which was the same year that Twitter was born in a park in San Francisco, Jay wrote about the people formerly known as the audience, which is a very compelling concept, and how they were seizing the tools of publishing for themselves. He and Dan Gilmore, another new media veteran who's also here in Perugia, believed that journalists should acknowledge that in many cases their readers, their audience, know more about a topic than they do, and that by bringing those people in and allowing them to help us, we can actually create better journalism. So when I first met Jay, he was promoting this idea at an online news association conference in Toronto, where I live in Canada. Anybody been to Toronto? It's pretty great, right? So Jay was there for a conference. I was a blogger at a newspaper in Toronto, constantly having to explain what the word blog meant and why it was such a dumb word. And so I reached out to Jay, and we met for a drink in this hotel bar. And Jay was talking about something that he called beat blogging. And beat blogging was the idea that reporters covering a specific topic, the environment or health or government or pretty much anything, could use social media blogs, and I think Twitter was just barely invented. So he was thinking about how you could use those tools to improve your reporting on a particular beat, how you could build a group of experts or just people who had experience in that area, and you could reach out to them and they could become a kind of expert help for you while you were writing about that topic. Very powerful concept. And Jay's still effectively working on new formulations of this idea. I think it's a big part of the membership puzzle project, which he's going to talk about, his interest in correspondent, membership-funded journalism, effectively community-powered journalism in a way. So in a lot of ways, I don't know how you feel, but the early days of blogging and Twitter seem like ancient history now. It seems like 100 years ago that I first started using Twitter. Now we have the President of the United States is using his social media account to declare war on countries and plan bombing attacks on Syria and so on, and promoting fake news. In a lot of ways, it's a darker time, I think, than those early days when we were sort of had a utopian view of what the web was going to allow. But in any case, the bottom line is that Jay has been around from the very beginning, and I think he's thought about a lot of these topics very deeply. So I think he's the perfect person to do this keynote. So please join me in welcoming Jay.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks to the festival for inviting me. It's a truly amazing event and an incredible venue. I teach in a program at NYU that focuses on innovation in journalism, And at the end of the program, when the students graduate, we make them give presentations about their final projects. And they work on them very hard, they practice them, they try to perfect them. And as they get closer to the date, they get nervous about giving what is, for many of them, their first public speech. And I say to them, you really shouldn't be nervous because the audience is really nervous. When people come to a public talk like this, they may not always realize it, but they have an undercurrent of anxiety because they don't want the speaker to suck. Because it's really embarrassing for that person, and it's kind of embarrassing for you to be listening to it. And so I say to my students, if you can start your talk with a little joke, people will laugh, and that will help them release the tension, and then they'll be able to listen to you. So my students listen to this, and they say to me, now we have to be funny? You're making it worse. So anyway, you can release your tension now because I know what I'm doing. See, it worked. My title is Optimizing Journalism for Trust. In a book called Politics and Vision, the philosopher Sheldon Wolin said that when there is vision, things appear in their corrected fullness. I really love that phrase, things appear in their corrected fullness. And this helps explain what I mean by optimizing for trust. It is a vision or direction in which we have to move, we who care about international journalism. For trust can no longer be assumed. Its continuous production has to be designed for. Nor does trust any longer follow from good practice, which is what American journalists used to mean by the term credibility. Once upon a time, you had credibility, that was the way they talked, if you followed the rules of good practice. And that doesn't work anymore. We have to redesign the modern news organization so that it is easier for people to trust it, which, of course, doesn't guarantee that they will. And we have to make it easier for people to form a relationship with the news sites whose work they value. Otherwise, Facebook and Google and maybe Apple News will own that relationship. It was Aaron Pailhofer of Temple University, formerly The Guardian and New York Times, who's here today, who got me thinking in this direction. In 2016, he asked, what would a news organization look like if it was optimized not for clicks, not for scoops, or for time on site, but for trust? I thought this was a great question. So I started talking about it on social media and writing about it. Emily Bell of The Guardian and Columbia, who was normally at this conference but absent this year, did not agree with me. She said the question was badly framed. She said that trust was a poor metric for quality journalism. Breitbart optimizes for trust, she said. So does the Daily Mail. At first, I didn't understand this objection. Certainly, I didn't trust Breitbart with news, nor did I think it was built for trust. And yet, I had to admit, its core supporters, its fans, did trust it. In a way, Breitbart was optimized for those fans. So in a way, it was optimized for trust. In wrestling with Emily's dismissal of trust as a poor metric, I realized that she was right about the question being badly framed. It's easy to get some people to trust you if you present as news only those things that support their existing beliefs. Or if you demonize the people they deeply resent, as Breitbart tends to do. And it works even better if the beliefs you are always confirming with your headlines have been labeled extreme by elites or dismissed as unfit for public discussion. A kind of trust can be built that way, on resentment news, on transgression, on confirmation bias. So I realized that my image of a newsroom optimized for trust was incomplete. The problem is not how to generate trust by publishing news. Trump, in a way, does that with his Twitter feed. And there's polling to indicate that he is more trusted as a source of information than the news media is by Republicans in the United States. In this sense, his campaign to discredit the American press is working. In one poll I found, Trump as an information source was more trusted among Republicans than even Fox News. If trust by itself is a poor metric, our design problem becomes how to combine high standards of verification with optimizing the news organization for trust. How to combine high standards of verification with optimizing the news organization for trust. Here's another way to say it. In publishing news, the hard part is not to stay in business. The kids in Macedonia, using Facebook and producing a simulation of news, can do that. The hard part, I said, is not to stay in business, it's to stay in journalism, which means to accept its constraints. The most important of which is, did that really happen? Along with, does the public need to know it? Did that really happen? Have we given a fair description of events? Breitbart doesn't care enough about these things to stay in journalism. Trump cares even less about verification, which is why he's a terrible source for news, and it's kind of terrifying that some people rely on him for that. For the kids in Macedonia and other bad actors like them, it's probably a defect if the crazy thing they're reporting as news actually happened. So let me repeat, the problem is not how to generate trust by publishing news that some people like and share. In a world of open platforms, that's pretty easy to do. The problem is how to combine high standards of verification with a bold and creative vision that optimizes for trust and finds support among readers, viewers, and listeners. Again, it's not how to stay in business, it's how to stay in journalism. That phrase, by the way, is not mine. It's from the British publisher Harold Evans. Now I want to unpack this suitcase I've been carrying around, the phrase optimizing for trust. When we click on that icon, here are some of the items it displays. When I can easily understand not only the news story I read when I clicked through, but the data policy I bought into when I signed up, that's optimizing for trust. When I know that you'll report it when it's nailed down, and that you'll also correct it when it comes apart, that's optimizing for trust. When I can click on your reporter's name and find not only her bio and archive, but where she's coming from, what motivates her in her journalism. That's optimizing for trust. When I can go to the About tab on your site and learn not only about your mission and ownership, but also about your reporting priorities, where you're spending scarce resources and why, that's optimizing for trust. When I can feel you getting better at listening to the internet, even as you publish on the internet, when I can add my knowledge to yours to make for a better product, when my attention is not grabbed but given, when you as a reporter not only know your stuff but show your work, when responding to criticism and sorting the valid from the invalid criticism is considered a vital newsroom skill that everyone has to be good at, when educating people with your journalism is joined to educating them about journalism and how it's done, when reporters share their learning curve, even as readers share their expertise, when the people who value the work elect to support it financially and want it to spread to the public it was made for, when you not only ask supporters for money, but explain how you use their money, when radical transparency combines with genuine diversity to make something better than objectivity, when all those things start happening together and form their own newsroom culture, then we're beginning to optimize for trust. As some of you know, for the past year, I've been working with the Dutch site, De Correspondent, as it expands into English language publishing. They have a clear sense of how to optimize for trust using the membership model. When I look at their design, the things I have been talking about here appear in their corrected fullness. That's why I'm helping the Correspondent break into the American market. They have a vision in Sheldon Wolin's sense. To conclude this, I need to point out that everything I've talked about today arises from a shift we ought to recognize and embrace in the journalism world. The users of journalism, the readers, the listeners, the viewers, the subscribers, the members, have more power now. They have more power. In part because they have more choice, in part because they are paying more of the costs as the advertising subsidy declines. Because the users of the product have more power, the makers of the product have to listen to them more. Increasingly, the quality of your journalism will depend on the strength of your relationship with the people who use and value your work. I want to repeat that because it's so important. The quality of your journalism will increasingly depend on the strength of your relationship with the people who recognize and value your work. Optimizing for trust is just a name for the shift in imagination required if news organizations are to recognize this new balance of power. Grazie.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions, and I'm sure lots of other people do too. So I'm going to ask some, and then I'm hoping that you'll ask some. You are the people formerly known as the audience, so please come up with some good ones. Jay loves the really hard questions. I had a bunch of questions I was going to start with, but I'm going to ignore those because I wanted to push back a little bit on. I see the structure of what you laid out, optimizing for trust, in sort of responding to Emily's criticisms. I remember being part of that conversation. I've had similar conversations with people here about trust being the wrong term, and I wanted, is it possible that, say, not just Breitbart, but something we don't even know about or something we haven't heard about, could do all the things that you said, have all the pieces of that structure, and still be doing something bad? So they could have fact-checking, they could have transparency, they could be building relationships with their readers, but all of those things could be based on falsehoods, could be based on, I mean, Fox News and Breitbart do what's almost a simulation of journalism. Yeah. It's like being in the upside down world, or going through the looking glass, where they're kind of, it looks like journalism, and yet what they're achieving is something bad. Could they do all the things you've described, but still be doing something wrong? Or
I see what you're asking, and I don't know. Fox, to take the example you cited, is terrible at verification.
True.
It's great at engaging its audience. It's discovered an unserved audience, which it deserves credit for. And there are some journalists at Fox who observe the routines of verification. But if you look at its most potent programming, it fails the verification test like 20 times an hour. So could it happen? I'm not sure, because even when you have an ideologically aligned news site with a loyal readership that believes in it, and there's like a fit there, even then, real journalism requires that sometimes you disappoint your supporters by reporting what is as opposed to what they want to be.
But I guess the risk is that some of those people won't care. So we might not define it as journalism because we're journalists. The audience for that content fundamentally won't care.
Sure. I think we're in that situation now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even verification and fact-checking, one of the things that I struggle with is that in some circles, particularly the alt-right in the US, when something is fact-checked by mainstream media and proven to be wrong, that's actually evidence of the opposite.
Yeah, true.
I don't know how do you correct that?
Get out of that loop?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Okay. It's one of the reasons I'm so disturbed.
Damn, I was hoping
by the current environment. No,
I was hoping you would know. Yeah.
Try another question.
Because now you're doing the exact thing that you think as a journalist or as a, someone who's fighting for truth, that this is what you should do, and the process is very straightforward, and there are lots of organizations that are doing it, and yet what they produce is not believed by...
Right. The economist A.O. Hirschman wrote a fascinating little book about 20 years ago called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And the thesis of this book was that when people are dissatisfied with a firm, he was writing about companies, but it could be governments, it could be systems. When people are dissatisfied with the system, they have three choices: exit, voice, and loyalty. Loyalty is when you stick around even though you're dissatisfied, right? Because you're a Cubs fan, and even though the Chicago Cubs haven't won since 1909,
Right.
what can you do? You're a Cubs fan.
Yeah.
Right.
Maple Leafs are the same.
Maple Leafs. That's loyalty. Voice is when you say, hey, Ford Motor Company, I bought a Ford and it broke down after a year and I'm very dissatisfied and
Right.
you should hear about my experience. That's voice. Right.
An exit is just you opt out.
An exit is you opt out. And the market is really good at exit because it allows you to just opt out, right? So one way of interpreting what's gone on in the American public sphere is that a portion of the electorate has exited from journalism. And when they do that, it's very hard for journalists to respond to that because they are not there. They're
Right.
not there on the receiving end of the press. And no, I don't know what to do about it, except I just gave you a description of it right, that can help you understand it.
And describing it is definitely a benefit. But I guess I've been thinking about particularly membership, community, the sort of goals that you're talking about that journalistic organizations can employ or rely on, or as an alternative to advertising, but also as a way of sort of serving a core readership or a core community and building those relationships and all the things that Dick Correspondent has done that are hugely powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about, every sword cuts two ways and everything that's powerful can be used for good or evil. So all of those things that I see as valuable, that I think you see as valuable, building community, strong relationships, membership, supporting, could all be used by bad people.
Well, whether that...
the tools themselves
whether
don't
those
make
tools,
it good.
whether that would survive high standards of verification, I'm not sure. That's
But
why
again-
I added it.
But again, high standards of verification is something that you and I care about. But
Well, they may not care about that, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're in that situation now.
That's a tough one. Does anybody have any solutions? Yes. Charlie has a solution.
I've just stolen the solution from Tanit, who's sitting next to me.
Okay.
It's not the solution, but it's the injunction upon journalism, which should always be. I completely agree with Jay about building communities and so on. But one of the other great injunctions of journalism is that it seeks attention. It goes and finds people to connect with. And isn't the thing, when we see people exit from journalism, shouldn't we just follow them? We should go where they are. We should stop calling them bad people, for example.
What if they are bad people?
Well, that's the problem, Matt. They're not going to listen to you if you call them bad people.
They might not listen anyway.
No, but then you don't have to follow them. But I think it's a moral, political, and even economic duty of journalists to follow and to understand.
Yeah. I think that's one strategy in this situation, is to, like Charlie said, follow the people who have exited from journalism and maintain your interest in them, right? And explain where they've gone in their ideological journey. And report on them back to the other people who are still kind of in the public sphere. I think there's value in that. It doesn't mean they're going to be customers for your reporting.
That could be valuable, but not a solution.
Right, it's not a
is
solution.
what I'm saying.
But to back up a second, in the 1950s, the great sociologist C. Wright Mills employed this very useful distinction between troubles and issues. And what he said is that troubles are the things that worry people in their daily lives, the things they talk about at night over the kitchen table with their spouse. Issues is what the political system makes to decide elections and fight and determine who has power. Right? When issues get too disconnected from troubles, you have a crisis of democracy. So another answer to what you could do is, like Charlie said, follow those people and try to reconnect the troubles to issues. That's a hard challenge, but it might be something that could address your question.
Well, that one is definitely going to take some more thought.
Yeah.
I wanted to turn to the membership puzzle for you to tell us a little bit more about
Sure.
what's involved in that. What are you hoping to get out of it? How does it work? How does the correspondent fit into it?
Well, I'm the director of the Membership Puzzle Project. It's a grant-funded program. It's a research project. And the correspondent is a partner in the project with us. And since the correspondent, the world's most successful member-funded news site, is trying to expand to the United States in English language publishing, we thought we would engage in kind of a two-way knowledge exchange. One is to bring the lessons of the correspondent's experience to the rest of journalism. And the other is to investigate other forms of membership that have been tried and some successful in the rest of the world so that the correspondent has the benefit of their experience. So that's essentially what the Membership Puzzle Project does. We're studying different membership models as we find them, and we're trying to clarify what's different about membership. So for example, a founding distinction of our project is that subscription is when you pay your money and you get a product. If you don't pay your money, you don't get the product. It's a product relationship. Membership is when you join the cause because you believe in the work.
Right, so there's a fundamental difference between membership and just paying for things.
Correct. And then we further distinguished, as we sorted through our research findings, between thin forms of membership and thicker forms of membership. Okay. Thin membership is when you are a member, you give money, maybe you get a tote bag, maybe you get some other goodies, but your relationship stops at donating money. Thicker forms of membership are, yes, you support with your money, but you also support with your knowledge, with other forms of participation. You're the people formerly known as the audience. You engage with the journalists. You help with sources. You help with fact-checking, all of which the correspondent has done very well. Finally, the really important thing about the distinction between subscription and membership is that membership does not require or necessarily imply a paywall. And the reason is that members of news sites that we talk to a lot of people who support news organizations, they want the work to spread beyond those who are able to financially support it. They want it to circulate. And so it's not like when you're a $400 a year subscriber to the Jessica Lessons The Information, where you subscribe because you want an edge over other people who don't subscribe. In membership, people support the journalism because they believe in the work, and therefore they want the work to spread.
So it's much more public focused than just a paywall. Because this is something
Yes.
I've been thinking about probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years. What is, because people would always use the terms subscription, paywall, you know, metered paywall, and membership as though they were all the same thing, but they're clearly not. Yeah.
Right. And membership is compatible, more compatible, with the public service mission of journalism, and it's more compatible with what motivates people to go into journalism.
And was that something that the correspondent thought about from the beginning? Was that the model that they deliberately chose?
Yes, they started first with no ads. And no ads has a huge effect, not only on your business model, but on everything you do. Because when you are no ads, attention is not the commodity anymore. And all sorts of bad habits that digital journalism got into by seeking attention only because they sold attention are unnecessary. The decision the correspondent made was, if you go to digcorrespondent.nl, you do meet a request to become a member, and you can't access the journalism randomly. But that's not how people access journalism. They access through social, through links, through the spread of others who are sharing it. So any link that you come upon to the correspondent is free, and there's no limit, there's no meter.
It doesn't time out.
It doesn't time out. But they came up with this ingenious little device. When you click on a link from the correspondent that a member, let's say, shared on Facebook, no matter how many degrees of separation away, it says this link.
Who shared it?
It says this link was brought to you by Matthew Ingram, member of the correspondent.
Right.
And a certain percentage of people see that little notice, and they say to themselves, could be 10%, 1%, maybe less than 1%, and they say, you know what? I want to be the person who's the patron providing the correspondent to other people. And that ends up being their best recruiting device.
So it's sort of virtue signaling in a way.
Yeah, it's that. It's also the feeling that if I'm getting something out of this, I should support it. And that's why we call membership joining the cause.
I think Sarah Lacey's site, Pando Daily, did something similar. I don't know if they got the idea from the correspondent, but I noticed it when I clicked a link that it said who shared it.
Yeah,
Very
there are
powerful,
other sites that do
very
that.
powerful.
Yeah, it is. It is a powerful thing.
So I'm curious why it's called the membership puzzle. What is the puzzle?
The puzzle is, what do you give people or offer them in order to get them to become members? And the traditional answer to that is
tote bags.
Yeah, goodies. We don't think that actually is very important at all.
Does the correspondent have tote bags?
No.
No. Okay.
So our question is, what sorts of opportunities to interact with the site, the journalists, the journalism, will draw people in and cause them to become members? And what are the strengths for the journalism of having members? Here's another way to think about it. I'm a subscriber to the New York Times. That's a product relationship. I've been a subscriber for more than 25 years. The number one asset the New York Times has is its brand. That's worth $1 billion. The second most valuable thing the Times owns is its people, the talented people. The third most valuable thing the Times has is not the trucks or the equipment, which could go out of date tomorrow. It's the readership. The knowledge and sophistication of the Times readership is an asset of immense value. And yet, no one within the New York Times is full-time, as far as I know, on the problem of how to get that knowledge and sophistication flowing in to the organization so as to make better journalism of it. That's a membership puzzle.
They do a certain amount of work on their comments, though, right? They have a team.
Yes.
They highlight comments.
Yes, they do.
Certain readers, I think, at one point they had an experiment where you could graduate effectively or be promoted if your comments were consistently good. You could escape moderation and your comment would just go up.
Yeah, they've actually done a lot on comments, and they've put a lot of energy into it. They've spent a lot of money on it. They've also spent technology time on it.
If anybody has a question, just feel free. Oh, there's one. Do we have a mic? Keep trying. Do we need it?
Oh, right, there we go. My question is, what's been the effect of the proliferation of cheap news on the growing distrust of the journalism institution over the last several decades?
The proliferation of cheap news.
Cheap news.
What is cheap news?
So in an attention economy, you want to create content for as cheap as possible so you could sell it for as high as possible. So, you know, the conversation around fake news is really important, but fake news is only possible because journalism has been producing cheap news for so long, and the cheapest news to create is fake news. So how has that played a role in growing distrust in the institution?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking. When we ask people, why do you become members of these independent news sites? Why are you a member of the Texas Tribune? Why are you a member of Reveal in California? Why are you a member of The Correspondent? They typically start off not by talking about the site that they're members of, but by listing a number of things about the news system that frustrate and dismay them. So they talk about clickbait. They talk about misleading headlines. They talk about old-fashioned sensationalism. They talk about stories that explode and dominate the news for 4 days, and then you never hear about them again. They talk about problems that are visited in the news, and we never hear anything about how to solve them.
And they see these sites as an alternative.
Yes, and they see these sites as the alternative to cheap news. And when we talk to other membership sites that are like new to our orbit, we describe this for them, and they say, "Oh, it's the same for us." Like sometimes they'll say word for word, that's what our members say. And so my interpretation of that is that membership is picking up on very widespread dissatisfaction with bad habits that journalists adopted as they tried to adapt their routines to digital publishing.
Which is fair, except I think the kind of thing we're talking about, whether it's cheap news or fake news or clickbait or sensationalized news, the media has always done that. Newspapers effectively invented clickbait before you could click. They wanted to sell newspapers. You know, the New York Sun made up Man Who Lived on the Moon and sold a billion newspapers. So maybe social technology in particular and the web have exaggerated that problem, but it was a problem that existed before.
Yeah, but it's just, it is come at people with a vengeance because of metrics, because of the speed, because of how many publishers there are, right? Because of the desperation that the declining advertising subsidy has created. So it's not that, I called it old-fashioned sensationalism. Right, it's been around forever, but these bad habits have overtaken a lot of journalism.
And would you say that Facebook and other platforms are key actors in doing that? That they sort of fuel that phenomenon?
That's one of the many problems with Facebook, yeah.
Does The Correspondent or do these other groups, do they make use of Facebook or do they avoid it?
They do, and I think they do what smart news sites do, which is if you know what your strategy is, if you know what you're trying to accomplish, then you can play ball with these systems as long as you have a way of knowing when they're not working for you. So, for example, I talked to Mark Thompson, the CEO of New York Times, about this. And the New York Times is a very clear strategy. They're trying to convert casual readers into digital subscribers. That's the whole game. Right? Once you have a very clear strategy like that, then you can try instant articles, you can try playing with Facebook, as long as you know what your strategy is and you have metrics of your own to tell you whether it's working or not. So The Correspondent, yeah, sure, they use Facebook, but there is nothing in their model that is dependent on Facebook for their survival.
Questions? Yes?
Mi scusi, io parlo in italiano, preferisco. Sono Monica Gobbato, sono un avvocato e sono anche una data protection officer, quindi mi occupo di privacy. Scusi, ripeto. Monica Gobbato, avvocato e data protection officer. Più che una domanda, è un'osservazione. Credo che adesso appunto c'è questa guerra dell'attenzione, no? E quindi bisogna in qualche modo cercare di arrivare alle persone. Se posso fare un paragone con questo evento, noi vediamo gente che ascolta per ore ed è interessatissima perché questo evento è molto ben riuscito. Allora mi chiedo perché questo evento è molto ben riuscito. Io credo che ci sia un mix tra tecnologia e passione. Questo evento è riuscito a mischiare tecnologia e passione. Mi piacerebbe che il giornalismo segua quello che sta succedendo, l'evoluzione nel digitale, mettendoci dentro tanta emozione. E questo potrebbe essere forse un inizio di una ricetta. Volevo sapere cosa ne pensate. Grazie.
The question was, how do you attract people to your journalism if it is responsible, verification-based? And the suggestion was that it's the combination of smart use of technology and the passion of good journalism that, that does it. And I agree with that. I think that's close to like the center of where we need digital journalism to go. It has to be very tech literate, very smart with numbers and metrics, very quick to adapt to new ways that the audiences are getting information, where they're spending their time, and extremely passionate about the traditional virtues of journalism, like holding people accountable and telling great stories and digging under the surface of things. And yeah, it's some kind of combination like that we need. Extremely tech savvy and deeply committed to both public service and to audience engagement. Somewhere in there is the future.
I have a question related to particularly the de correspondent model. So no advertising. Mm-hmm. And I agree that there's a certain purity to that. You're connected directly to your supporters, directly to your members. No one gets in the way of that relationship. Is advertising fundamentally incompatible with the type of membership or community-based journalism you're talking about?
I wouldn't say that. I think the business model sustainability problem in public service journalism is so hard, so challenging, that we should celebrate anybody who solves it for themselves. And I don't think there's going to be like one model to replace the one that the internet broke. There's going to be a series of one-offs, a series of individual solutions. And typically, it will involve a mix of revenue. But I have to go back to something you said, that the virtues of the ad-free model that the correspondent uses, it's not about purity. It's not about like, we're too good for advertising. It's a very practical decision that they're making.
I just meant it was cleaner. Not so
it's
much
cleaner,
pure.
okay, right. But when you say purity...
Less encumbered. Yeah, I didn't mean purity like, you know, well, angels and purity and whatnot. I just meant like cleaner.
It's cleaner.
More efficient.
And it allows them to escape from the daily news cycle.
Right.
Which is another thing that its members say they like about it.
So the other related question, I guess, and if anybody has another one, please put your hand up. We're getting close to out of time, but so membership-based communities, are they inherently smaller because they're just reach isn't a big part of what they do? They're not going to be mass. They're not going to be, because there aren't enough people who want to do that. Are they inherently smaller, focused, and is there a problem that they become more insular because they sort of, it's a virtuous circle involving just the true believers?
Well, the paying members are a subset and a small subset of the readers. So we shouldn't think of the members and the readers as the same thing. But inevitably, those who become members are going to be merely a sample of the public that, let's say, the correspondent addresses. And yes, they're quite aware. We asked them this question. They're quite aware that they're not a representative sample of Dutch people, nor are the journalists at the correspondent, and they're highly aware of that as well. But it doesn't mean that the journalism has to be limited to those people.
True.
Because it circulates beyond that. Also, one of the reasons that I stressed the strength of the relationship between journalists and the people who value their work is that real journalism puts strain on that relationship. It's sort of like a marriage if you've ever been married. I know you are.
I don't know what you're talking about. Strain. Yeah.
Okay, just hear me out. Hear me out here.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll recognize it eventually. The stronger your relationship, the more easy it is to withstand the ups and downs of a marriage. It's similar in journalism. When people have a strong bond because they understand your mission, they agree with it, they support the work, they join the cause, they also know how journalism operates, they're literate in how it unfolds. When you have that kind of a relationship, then when a story appears that alienates them or makes them angry or they disagree with it, they're willing to live with it, right? That's loyalty, right? They're not going to exit right away. And when you're strong on voice, which is what the correspondent is, you give them a lot of voice, that also creates loyalty. So it's not that the members have to become censors of the journalism. When the relationship is healthy, the journalism can range well beyond the members. But still, are they a representative sample of Dutch society? No, they're not.
Question.
Yeah, we talked about advertisement, but we didn't talk so much about sponsors. Like, for instance, this festival has some very big sponsors, like Amazon or Facebook, Google. My question is, can sponsorships like undermine trust, between readers and publishers?
Good question.
It can. Certainly, if you're taking money from Facebook and you're trying to report on Facebook, that's a problem, right? But we can also start to educate sponsors that when you lend support to journalism, it means that you're not only not going to get a break from the journalists you're sponsoring, but chances are they're going to end up criticizing you. The more we're able to educate sponsors about that, the more viable sponsorship becomes, but it still is inevitably going to raise that question. So it's not a magic solution. But that's why I say we're never going to find a model to replace the one the internet broke, and so we have to be patient and tolerant with all kinds of different combinations of funding that allow public service journalism to go on.
Anyone else? Yeah.
So I'm looking for a recommendation. I work for a huge organization in Germany, the ARD. We have a perfect membership model. We force people to pay 17 euros a month, and they all pay us.
How do you force them?
It's tax-like,
Okay.
so they actually go to jail if they don't pay.
Terrific. That's a great model.
So you should all adopt it.
Yeah,
So,
that's...
but it's a huge organization. I kind of envy the correspondent and crowd reporter who's doing the same thing in Germany for the possibility to report the news that way. I think it's great to have those communities, but as a huge organization as we are, we report all the news all the time. How do we even begin to do that? Do we have any recommendations on that?
How do you begin
to have this community model? Like we have a thing where we answer questions that come up in Facebook a lot, and we do some real digging and produce good journalism around that. That's a way to start, but you cannot have a group of 80 million people talking with
How do you build a
about your-
community with 18 million people?
Well, the first thing you do is you master the 1% rule of online life. The 1% rule says in any publishing situation online, 90% of the people who come to your site will only consume the product. That's all they'll ever do. 10% may engage in some way, like leave a comment or register. And 1% may become actual contributors to the site. And so you're not talking about 18 million people. You're talking about 1% at most of those people that you need to start engaging. So that's one answer. Another answer is a project that I'm currently running called Join the Beat, in which we're trying to figure out how would membership work at the level of a beat, a reporter's beat. And the idea is people who have either specialized knowledge, expertise, experience in that beat, or passion, which means time to devote to it, can become members of it and help make the journalism better. So there, what we're asking is for the journalists not to engage with 18 million people, which is a practical impossibility, but to engage with a small subset of those people who feel strongly about the journalism done in that beat and have either knowledge, experience, or time to devote to it. And so that makes it much more manageable.
Does it ever bother you that we were talking about this 10 years ago? Same idea?
Not only were we talking about this 10 years ago, I ran a project identical to this in 2009, and I'm doing it again 9 years ago because it didn't work the first time, and I think maybe the third or fourth will be the charm, right? Does that bother me? It did at one time. Now I've become a patient man.
I admire your stick-to-itiveness. I think this is the fourth or fifth time at least, under different names.
Because in this case, I believe that one day this is the way beat journalism will be done.
I hope you're right.
I just hope I'm alive when it happens.
I think we have time for one more, maybe. Yes? Torsten?
Hi. I'd just like to add something to the person from the IRD. In terms of identifying a subset of people, it might be worthwhile considering to look at people in Germany who are already in a certain mode of like what the correspondent is doing in the Netherlands. I'm from Perspective Daily, which is a kind of, you can say, clone of the correspondent. We're doing a very similar thing of journalism. And feel free to get in touch with Perspective Daily in terms of identifying that subset of people.
Do you have a question?
No, it's just a comment, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Does anybody have a question?
By the way, Ernst Jan, the CEO of The Correspondent, and myself are doing a session tomorrow about the way The Correspondent does its journalism and does this kind of engagement. So if you're interested in getting more details about it, tomorrow, show up.
So Tracy Powell with All Digitocracy and the Democracy Fund. I want to push back a little bit, I think. We talk a lot about consumers not trusting us, but what if they trust us to do exactly what we've always done and how we've always done it? Charlie mentioned earlier about following the people who've exited. Well, they haven't exited completely. They may have exited mainstream journalism, but they follow independent journalists or independent news organizations who they trust or who they have a relationship with. And I wonder what's stopping us from doing a better job collaborating with those people or those organizations that are trusted by news users.
I think it's an excellent point. If they've exited from the mainstream news system, but they found individual journalists or specialty sites that they do trust, then that's something that the rest of the press needs to understand, support. That's where collaboration can come in and become extremely valuable. And if they're not there on the end of your communication channel, but they are on someone else's, that's something to pay attention to. It's also a case where I think academics, journalism schools can help bridge the gap between a kind of journalism that's alive for audiences that felt badly served by the mainstream media and the rest of the press. So, Tracy, I take your point completely. I think it's an excellent observation.
And I think we are out of time. So please thank Jay for coming.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming. And Jay will be around tomorrow, session tomorrow. And if you see him walking around, he loves people to just interrupt him randomly with questions. Feel free to do that. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Very good.
It's good.